The alien surgeon thought the human was finished. Then the monitor changed. In the 19th hour of the operation, Chief Surgeon Anvarr Sel finished the last repair she knew how to make, and understood that she had run out of medicine. She held the position for a moment longer than she needed to. Her 6 fingers were still inside the human's chest, still cradling the small, stubborn, badly wounded muscle that had been fighting her all night, and she did not want to take them out, because taking them out meant the work was over, and the work being over meant something she was not prepared to say out loud. The theater was very quiet. Kesh Anchorage was a mining station. A rough sprawl of docking arms and ore silos hung in orbit above the gas giant Vaughn, and it was almost never quiet anywhere. But Trauma Theater 1 had been built with double walls and a hum-damping floor, and at hour 19, the only sounds left in it were the whisper of the perfusion pump, the low grinding breath of Rusk's ventilator, and the column. The column stood at the head of the table, a slender gray pillar of light and glass that read every measurable thing about the body beneath it, and rendered those things as a single luminous ribbon of data, spiraling slowly downward like water in a drain. 240 channels. Blood chemistry, tissue oxygen, neural coherence, metabolic reserve, the pressures inside every chamber that had a pressure worth knowing. And at the base of the spiral, in a small, unhurried font, the only number in the room that anyone in the Concord actually trusted. Serran Index, 0.06. Anvarr withdrew her hand. "Closing," she said. Tem Asa, her resident, moved the retractor without being asked. He was young, barely 11 years past his first cut, and he had been holding his shoulders in a rigid knot since hour 12, which was a thing Anvarr had been meaning to correct in him and had not, because at hour 12 she had still believed she was going to win. She closed, she did it properly. She had trained under Surgeon Master Iolin Vaughn, who had beaten one thing into her above all others, that the last stitch in a hopeless case must be as good as the first stitch in a savable one, because the body did not know which one it was, and neither truly did you. So she closed the human girl's chest the way she would have closed a senator's, layer by layer, tension even, no hurry, and when it was done she looked at the small pale face above the drape and thought, without permitting herself any softness about it, 19 years old. The Durun did not weep. Their eyes were built wrong for it. They had a second lid, a clear membrane that swept sideways, and when a Durun was in grief the membrane simply stayed closed a fraction of a second longer with each blink, so that the world went dark and dark and dark. Anvarr blinked, and the world went dark and dark. "Time," said Rusk from the head of the table. Rusk was a Grelth, heavy worlder, broad as a bulkhead, with a voice that came out of him like gravel poured down a chute. He had run anesthesia on this station for 31 years, and he had never once, in Anvarr's memory, said an unnecessary word. 19 hours 40, said Tem. "That is not what he is asking," said Anvarr. Tem's throat moved. He knew what Rusk was asking. Everyone in the room knew. The column knew too. It had been counting. A soft chime came out of it, not an alarm. The column did not alarm for this, because this was not an emergency. This was a conclusion, and a line of text unfolded itself in the air above the girl's head, patient and gentle and absolutely certain. Serran Index, 0.06. Sustained subthreshold interval, 6 HOURS 2 minutes. Cessation of intervention is indicated under Concord Medical Code, Article 9. Prepare Form 9C. Anvarr stripped her gloves. They were long, sheathed to the elbow, and they came away from her forearms with a sound like a held breath being let out. "Prepare it," she said. Tem did not move. "Resident," she said. "Yes, surgeon." He went to the console. Anvarr stood where she was and made herself look at the girl, because she had a rule about that too, and the rule was, you look. You do not let them go out of the world with everyone in the room staring at a machine. The human's name was Wren Halloway. 19 standard years. Hull diver apprentice, 3rd class out of the Ortender lamplighter. She had a narrow face and a broad flat nose and hair the color of rusted iron, shaved short at the sides in the way the belt crews wore it, and a spray of small brown flecks across her cheekbones that Anvarr had spent an embarrassing amount of hour 4 trying to identify as a pathology before Bell had told her kindly that they were called freckles and that they were nothing. She had scars on her knuckles. She had a tan line at her wrists where the dive gloves ended. She had a callus on the inside of her right thumb, and Anvarr, who noticed hands the way other people notice faces, had noticed it and wondered about it and would now never know what it was from. She was, by every metric the civilized galaxy possessed, finished. The Serran Index was not a guess. That was the thing people outside medicine never understood about it. It was not a doctor's shrug rendered as a decimal. It was the distillation of 11,000 years of clinical record across 406 species, a function that took neural coherence, tissue perfusion, and metabolic reserve, and returned the probability that a body, given every resource that existed, could be brought back to a life it would want. Above 0.4 you fought. Between 0.1 and 0.4 you fought harder and you sometimes lost, and you were not ashamed. Below 0.1, sustained, you stopped, because in 61,000 recorded instances of a sustained subthreshold index, across 406 species, across 11,000 years, the number of patients who had ever come back was 0. 0, not a small number, not a rounding, 0. The Durun had built the index. Anvarr's own great-grandmother's name was in the 3rd revision. It was the single greatest gift her people had given the conquered, and its greatness was not that it saved lives, plenty of things saved lives, but that it stopped medicine from becoming a torture, that it drew a line and said, "Past here, you are no longer treating the patient. Past here, you are treating yourself. We do not prolong. We do not abandon, we know when." Every Durun surgeon learned those 9 words in their first year. Anvarr had said them at 430 bedsides. She had said them to grieving parents and to raging spouses, and once to an entire mining crew standing in the corridor with their helmets under their arms. She believed them. She had built a life on them, and the life had been a good one. "Form is ready, surgeon," said Tem. "Read it." On this date at Kesh Anchorage, Chief Surgeon Anvarr Sel, having exhausted all indicated intervention, certifies that further treatment of the patient Wren Halloway offers no reasonable prospect of restoration and constitutes. He stopped. "Constitutes harm," said Anvarr. "Say it." "Constitutes harm. Intervention is withdrawn. Comfort is continued to the end." Anvarr crossed the theater. The console waited. Her thumbprint would do it. One press and the pumps would slow, and the drugs would change from the ones that fought to the ones that eased, and Wren Halloway would take perhaps 40 minutes to stop, and it would not hurt, and it would be, by every standard Anvarr had, correct. She lifted her hand, and she thought with no warning at all, the way a stone comes through a window, about the tether. They had brought the girl in 11 hours after the shear. That was the first impossible thing about her, and Anvarr had been too busy to notice it as impossible. Bay 6 of the lamplighter had suffered a gravitic containment failure while the tender was cutting a nickel body in the 9-fold belt, a shear event, the field collapsing and reforming across a 3-meter front, which does to a body roughly what a closing door does to a hand, except that the door is everywhere at once. 6 crew in the bay. 2 died instantly. 3 had been thrown clear and were bruised and screaming and alive. The 6th was Wren Halloway, and she had not been thrown clear because she had gone the wrong way. The deck apprentice had been down. That was in the incident log, which Anvarr had skimmed in the 90 seconds she had spent skimming anything at all. A 17-year-old Durun boy named Ket, who had been at the cutting head when the field went, and who had been knocked unconscious with his suit venting, and who by every reasonable expectation should have been the 3rd corpse in that bay. And in the confusion, with the field still snapping and reforming, and the emergency bulkhead coming down in 8 seconds, Wren Halloway had gone back into the sheer front to get him. She had clipped him to the safety tether. That was what the log said. Suit telemetry showed she had made it to him, hooked her own tether to his harness ring, and hauled, and the field had caught her on the second pull. And after that her telemetry became a set of numbers that Anvarr, reading them at hour 1, had assumed were a sensor fault, because they described a person who ought to have been dead. And then the bulkhead had come down, and Bay 6 had lost pressure and heat, and Wren Halloway had lain in the dark at -50 degrees for 11 hours while the crew of the lamplighter cut their way in. She had been clipped to Ket the whole time. When the rescue team got the plate off, they had found the two of them together, the boy's harness ring locked into her line, and the boy had been alive, insulated by the body of a species he barely knew, and she had been, well, she had been what she was now, more or less. Cold, silent, not obviously anything. The rescue lead, a hard old belt hand named Davion, had refused 3 times to leave the bay without her, and had said one sentence to the intake nurse that Bell had repeated to Anvarr in the scrub room, and that Anvarr had dismissed at the time as the sort of thing people say. She's not dead, she's cold. There's a difference, ask a human. Anvar's hand hovered over the console. Ket Von was 2 decks down in Ward 4 with a mended clavicle and a mild anoxic insult, and a Serran Index of 0.94, and he was going to live for another 200 years, and he was going to have children and grandchildren and a trade, and an argument on a station platform someday about the price of grain, and every one of those things existed because a 19-year-old apprentice of a species with no natural claws, no armor, no radiation tolerance, and a lifespan barely longer than a Durun adolescence had turned around into a collapsing gravity field and gone back for a boy she had known for 11 days. Anvarr had operated on Ket herself that afternoon in 90 minutes, and she had been proud of it, and she had gone from that theater into this one and had not thought about it again. She thought about it now. Her hand did not descend. "Surgeon," said Rusk. She did not answer. "Anvarr." The Grelth almost never used her name. She turned. He was standing with one huge gray hand resting on the ventilator housing, and his eyes, small, deep-set, the eyes of a creature evolved to squint at a sun through 8 atmospheres of murk, were on her, and they were not unkind. "You did everything," he said. "Yes. You did more than everything. That Yordic repair was," he shook his head slowly, a Grelth gesture that had nothing to do with negation. "I will tell people about it. For years." "Then it will be a very short story," said Anvarr, "because it did not work." "That is not what the story is about." Anvarr looked back at the girl. The drape had been folded down. Under the theater lights, the human skin had a bad gray undertone, and her lips were the color of old slate, and the temperature readout beside her head, the number no one had been paying attention to, because it was not one of the 3 that mattered, said 28.1 degrees. 28 degrees. They had been warming her for 19 hours, and she had come up 9 degrees, and she was still 8 below the temperature at which a Durun's blood would have gelled in her veins. Something moved far back in Anvarr Sel's mind. It was not a thought yet. It was the shape a thought makes when it is still underwater. "Column," she said, "confirm the coherence channel." The column answered in its calm, low, gender-neutral voice, the voice they gave to every diagnostic array in the Concord, because the studies said it was the voice people found easiest to be told terrible things by. "Neural coherence, 0.02. Trace is isoelectric across all 16 grid nodes, confirmed at 11-minute intervals for the past 6 hours and 2 minutes. There is no measurable cortical activity. Evoked potentials. Absent. Brainstem. Absent." "Then she is dead," said Anvarr, "and I am closing a corpse." That determination is yours to make, Surgeon, said the column. Not mine, I report. The index integrates. Article 9 states that where coherence is absent and the index is sustained sub-threshold, cessation is indicated. Indicated, Anvarr repeated. Yes. Not mandated. There was the smallest pause. Machines did not hesitate. The column had been programmed to insert that pause anyway, because the study said that too. Cessation is indicated at 6 hours, it said. Cessation is mandated at 96 hours by review of the cessation board, unless the index has risen above 0.1. Tem's head came up. Rusk said very quietly, Anvarr. She stood there with her hand above the console, and she did not press it, and the seconds went by, and the perfusion pump whispered, and somewhere far below them a cargo hauler kicked its engines, and the whole vast bones of Kesh anchorage shuddered faintly, the way they did 40 times a day. 28 degrees, she thought. She has been cold this entire time. Every value in that index, every single one, was measured on a body at 28 degrees. And underneath that, the thing she did not have words for yet, the shape under the water. The index has been right 61,000 times. How many of those 61,000 were human? Surgeon, said Tem, the form. Anvarr Sel lowered her hand. She did not touch the console. She reached past it, to the intercom panel, and she opened the theater line to the whole surgical floor, and she heard her own voice come out flat and steady, and entirely unlike the inside of her chest. This is Sel. Theater 1 is closed to new cases. Trauma reroutes to Theater 2 under Surgeon Kaido. I am keeping this patient. The intercom hissed. Repeat, Theater 1, said the floor coordinator. I am keeping this patient, said Anvarr, for 96 hours. She closed the line. Nobody in the theater said anything for a long moment. Tem was staring at her with his mouth slightly open, which in a Durun was not a very expressive gesture but was, in Tem Asa, roughly equivalent to a scream. Rusk had not moved at all. Anvarr walked back to the table. She looked down at the girl with the freckles and the rusted iron hair and the callus on her thumb, at the 98 kilos of pumps and lines and warming plates that were the only thing standing between her and the cold and permanent dark, and she put one long gray-green hand flat on the edge of the table, the way she had been taught to do at her very first bedside, 112 years ago, when Iolin Vaughn had told her, "This is where the patient can see you, if there is any of them left to see." "Give me 1 more hour," she said. She was not speaking to Rusk. 1 more hour and then another one. That is all I am asking of you. The column's ribbon of data turned slowly in the air, and the number at the bottom of it did not change. Serran Index, 0.06. Rusk let out a breath like a hydraulic seal. 96 hours, the Grelth said. You understand what they will do to you? Yes. They will take your theater. They will take your name off the index revisions. Marrow will come. Yes. And at the end of it, said Rusk, and now there was something raw in the gravel, she will still be dead, and you will have spent 4 days doing violence to a body that cannot feel it, and you will have to live in that. Anvarr Sel raised her head and blinked, and the world went dark and light again. Then let me be wrong for 4 days, she said. The code gives me 4 days. She gave that boy 11 hours. She turned to the console and began, methodically, to cancel the cessation form. Tem, get me the intake telemetry from the lamplighter, the raw stream, not the summary. Rusk, I want the warming rate cut. The Grelth's head came round. Cut. Cut, said Anvarr, by half. She is 8 degrees under. Protocol is aggressive rewarming. Conquered protocol, said Anvarr, was written for conquered bodies. She was looking at the temperature readout and at the flat gray isoelectric line beneath it, and the shape under the water was beginning, very slowly, to surface. This is not one. Word traveled through Kesh Anchorage the way it traveled through every station in the belt, instantly and wrong. By hour 22, 3 separate versions of the story were circulating in the mess halls. In one, the Durun chief surgeon had gone mad and barricaded herself in a theater with a corpse. In another, she was performing an illegal experiment on a human cadaver at the behest of an off-book research syndicate. In the third, the one that spread fastest, because it was the one the belt crews wanted to be true, Anvarr Sel had looked at the girl who went back into the shear for a Durun boy and had said, in front of witnesses, that no machine was going to tell her when to stop. She had said nothing of the kind, but she was not going to spend a minute of the 96 correcting it. Administrator Andrel Sae arrived at hour 23. He came alone, which Anvarr respected, and he waited outside the scrub room until she came out to him, which she respected more. He was a slight man of the Sev, feathered at the temples, and he had run this station for 9 years without a single serious quarrel with its medical staff, which on a mining anchorage was an achievement close to sorcery. Anvarr, he said. Andrel, I have read the column's log. He folded his hands. I want to say first that I am not here to bully you. Then why are you here? Because I have a shuttle inbound from the Ninefold with 11 casualties, arrival in 6 hours, and you have taken a trauma theater out of the rotation and put my chief surgeon in it with a patient who has no brain activity. He said it without heat. That was the trouble with Andrel Sae. He was never unfair, which made him very difficult to fight. I am here to ask you what you think you are doing in words, so that when the board asks me, I can tell them I asked. Anvarr dried her hands. She was aware, distantly, of being 31 hours without sleep, and of the way the light in the corridor had begun to acquire a very faint tremble at the edges. I think, she said, that the index has never been calibrated on a human being. Andrel blinked. That cannot be right. Column, said Anvarr, to the panel on the wall. How many humans are in the Serran calibration set? 411 human clinical records are indexed, said the column. How many of those are trauma cases with a sustained subthreshold index? A pause. 9. How many of those 9 ended in cessation? 9. How many of those 9 were rewarmed from below 30 degrees core before the index was computed? The pause was longer this time. That parameter is not recorded in the human dataset, said the column. Anvarr let the silence sit for a moment in the corridor between herself and the administrator of Kesh Anchorage. 411 records, she said. Andrel, my species has 11 million records in that set. The Vesh have 4 million. The Grelth, who joined the Concord 800 years ago and are famously reluctant to see a doctor, have 90,000. Humans have 411, because humans have been in the Concord for 41 years and most of them are on ships that never file anything, and the human viability curve in the Serran function is not measured. It is extrapolated. It was fitted by a committee on Hess Station in 11 days from the closest anatomical analog they could find, which was the auroch of Meth, a large mammal with a similar cardiac architecture and a similar oxygen affinity. Anvarr hung the towel, and a body temperature that, if it drops 4 degrees, kills it. Andrel Sae was quiet. Humans, Anvarr said, get cold, and then sometimes they get warm again. Sometimes. Yes. Anvarr, he said it gently. The girl has no cortical trace, not a low trace, none. There is no framework in medicine in which that is survivable. There is no framework in conquered medicine in which that is survivable. Is there another kind? I do not know yet, said Anvarr Sel. That is what I intend to spend the next 73 hours finding out. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He reached out and touched the back of her hand, 2 fingers, the Seth gesture of a debt acknowledged. The theater stays yours, he said. Not because I agree with you, because in 9 years you have never once been wrong about a patient in a way that cost anything, and I would be a fool to spend my whole account of you on the first time. He turned to go and stopped. But Anvarr, the board convenes at hour 96. Marrow has already filed. I know. He has asked for suspension of license in the event of a negative finding, not censure, suspension. I know that too. Andrel C's feathers lifted very slightly, which was the Seth equivalent of a sigh. Then I hope she is cold, he said, and not dead. Bay 9 was the old trauma theater, decommissioned 4 years earlier when the new suite went in, and it smelled of cold metal and long disuse. Its lights came up in slow yellow stages. Its floor still had the scuffed gray rectangle where the old table had been bolted down, and its walls still carried the hand-painted line the original station builders had left there, 140 years ago, in the days when Kesh Anchorage had been 3 cargo cans welded to a rock. Keep going. Anvarr had never noticed it before. She noticed it now, and she chose, deliberately, not to make anything of it. They moved Wren Halloway into Bay 9 at hour 26. It took 40 minutes, and it was the most dangerous thing anyone had done to her since the shear. 11 separate lines, a perfusion circuit, a warming lattice, a ventilator, and a body with a mean arterial pressure that lived or died on the 10th of a unit. Tem carried the pump. Bella Cheer, the Vesh nurse, small and quick, with the 4-jointed hands of her people and an entirely unearned reputation for sweetness, walked backwards the whole way with her palms flat on the girl's chest drain, keeping the tubing from kinking. Rusk came. He did not announce that he was coming. He simply appeared at the head of the trolley with the ventilator under one arm like a piece of luggage and said nothing at all. And when Anvarr looked at him, he looked back with an expression that dared her to comment. She did not comment. By hour 28, they had her set up in the middle of that empty gray room under the hand-painted words, with 1 column relay slaved to the main array. And Anvarr Sel stood at the foot of the table and made herself do the thing she should have done at hour 6. She stopped looking at the index. That was the discipline of it, and it was harder than it sounded, because the index was designed to be looked at. It was designed to gather your eyes the way a wound gathers your hands. It sat there in its calm luminous font at the base of the spiral, 0.06, and every time Anvar's gaze drifted to it, something in her chest went slack and gray. So she turned the display off. "Surgeon," said Tem, alarmed. "It is a number that predicts an outcome," said Anvarr. "I do not need to be told the outcome. I need to be told the problems. Column, give me a problem list, ranked by what will kill her soonest." The ribbon reorganized itself. 1. Potassium 6.9 and rising. Cause: crush injury with ongoing muscle breakdown and renal failure. Time to lethal arrhythmia at current rate, 4 to 7 hours. 2. Metabolic acidosis, pH 7.06, lactate 14. 3. Anuric renal failure bilateral, no urine output in 19 hours. 4. Coagulopathy. The patient cannot form a stable clot. 5. Left ventricular contusion with a 2 cm region of noncontractile myocardium, adjacent to the aortic repair at the root, which is holding at a pressure margin of 11%. 6. Pericardial fluid, 20 milliliters rising slowly. 7. Bilateral pulmonary contusion with a shunt fraction of 38%. 8. Core temperature 28.4 degrees. 9. Absent cortical activity. "Good," said Anvarr. Bell's 4-jointed hands paused over the drug tray. "Good, surgeon." "Every one of those except the last is a plumbing problem," said Anvarr, "and I am a plumber. Start at the top. Rusk, calcium, then insulin and dextrose, then get me the filtration unit out of storage. The old one, the Carrick pattern. It will run on a hand crank if the power drops." That unit is 11 years old. It is 11 years old and it works, which is more than can be said for her kidneys. Anvarr was already moving. Tem, you are on the acidosis. Bicarbonate is a lie and I do not want it. I want you to fix the reason. Which is? Tem's mouth opened, closed. Perfusion, he said. Tissue perfusion if we increase the flow rate. You will burst my aortic repair. What else? Temperature, said Tem slowly. The colder she is, the less she generates. Now you are being a doctor. What does the cold do to the potassium? He stopped, and Anvarr saw the moment his brain caught up with his mouth and saw him hate what he found there. It should protect her. Cold reduces metabolic demand. It reduces oxygen consumption. It should protect her brain most of all. But the conquered protocol says rewarm aggressively because a Durun body at 28 degrees is a Durun body that is dying of cold. Yes. Anvarr snapped a fresh line into the femoral port. Tell me, resident, if you fall into the water on Durun Prime, the real water, the deep lake in the crater, how long do you have? 11 minutes, said Tem. Perhaps 12. The cold stops the heart. And a human. Tem said nothing. Column, said Anvarr. Longest recorded human survival in cold water immersion, with no respiration. That data is not in the Concord Clinical Index, said the column. Where is it? There is an unindexed corpus, said the column, submitted by the human delegation at accession and never integrated. 211 petabytes. It is not searchable through standard clinical channels. Anvarr straightened up slowly. 211 petabytes, she said. Yes. Of what? Of human medicine, said the column. Approximately 4,000 years of it. The room went very quiet. Rusk, who had been priming the filtration circuit with his broad gray back to them, stopped priming. 4,000 years, Anvarr said. Human civilization has practiced organized medicine for approximately that long. The corpus was flagged as low priority for integration. Pre-contact species records are generally considered, the column paused, of anthropological rather than clinical value. Because their medicine is primitive. That was the stated rationale. Anvarr looked down at the girl on the table, at the small chest, rising and falling on the ventilator's rhythm, at the closed eyes, at the flat, dead, isoelectric line stitched across the top of the display, 16 nodes and not one flicker in any of them. 4,000 years of a species that had spent every one of those years being fragile, being cold, being crushed, being drowned, being burned, being torn open in wars they invented, being killed in more ways than any species in the conquered had ever needed to be killed. And then, apparently, having strong enough opinions about all of it to write 211 petabytes. Nobody had read it. Nobody had read a word of it, because it had been written by people who did not have gravity fields or coherence grids, and everyone knew there was nothing to learn from that. Anvarr felt something go through her that she would later, with great reluctance, identify as shame. Open it, she said. Surgeon, the corpus is. Open it, give it to my terminal. Now. It will take 11 hours to index at the resolution you will require. Then index it in the background and give me a search line in the meantime, said Anvarr Sel, and start with 3 words. Which words, surgeon? She said them slowly, the way you say a thing you have never said before and suspect you will be saying for the rest of your life. Cold human survival. They kept her alive through hour 31 on chemistry alone. The potassium came down, calcium first, to protect the heart from the electrical chaos. Then insulin with dextrose driving the potassium back inside the cells where it could not stop anything. Then at last the old Carrick filter, wheezing and clattering on its cart, pulling the girl's blood out through a filament bundle the width of Anvar's wrist and giving it back clean. It was ugly agricultural medicine. the kind of thing a conquered surgeon saw once in training and then never again. Rusk ran it with his enormous hands and a manual clamp, and the patience of a species that had spent 400,000 years underground. The acidosis came down after the potassium, because the acidosis was the potassium's fault, and because Anvarr had made Tim prove that to himself with a pen and a sheet of film rather than telling him, which took 19 minutes she did not have, and which she never once regretted. At hour 34, the aortic repair began to weep. It was not a rupture. It was a slow seep at the proximal suture line, 5 milliliters an hour into the pericardium, and it was the sort of thing that killed a patient over 6 hours by squeezing the heart to a stop in its own bag. In a healthy body, Anvarr would have opened the chest and put a stitch in it. In this body, opening the chest again meant a cardiac arrest she would not get back from. She stood in bay 9 and looked at the seep and did arithmetic. "Drain it," she said. 12 gauge, subxiphoid, and leave it in. We will keep pulling the bag empty for as long as it takes for the suture line to seal itself." "And if it does not seal itself," said Rusk. "Then it does not," said Anvarr, and put the needle in herself. At hour 38, Attendant Marrow came. He came at the end of the shift change, which was a courtesy, and he stood in the doorway of bay 9 with his hands behind his back and did not step over the threshold, which was law. The cessation attendants of the Concord were the only medical officers forbidden to touch a patient. It was the oldest rule they had. It was there so that no one could ever say that the officer who counts the hours had a hand in what he counted. He was Vesh, tall, dry, colorless, with a face that gave nothing at all. Anvarr had known him 11 years and had never disliked him and had never, not for one instant, been able to relax in his presence. "Chief Surgeon." "Attendant." "You have cancelled a 9C. "I have." "That is your right, under Article 9, for 96 hours from the first subthreshold reading." He recited it the way a priest recites. "I have filed for board review at the 96th hour. If the index has not risen above 0.1 by that time, cessation will be enforced, and I will move for suspension of your license to practice." "Yes." Marrow's head tilted. "Just slightly." "You are not going to argue?" "No." "Surgeon Sel," something in the dry voice changed. "May I speak outside the record?" "Speak." "I have witnessed 406 cessation," said Marrow. "I have witnessed 19 doctors do what you are doing. Every one of them believed sincerely that they were the exception. Every one of them was tired and grieving and certain. Not one of them was right. And afterwards every one of them was worse, not disgraced, worse. Something in them had broken, and they went on cutting with it broken, and the patients after paid for it." He inclined his head, very slightly, toward the table. "I am not your enemy. The code is not your enemy. The code is the only friend that girl has left, because it is the only thing in this room that will not use her to feel better." The words went into Anvarr Sel like a splinter and stayed. "Attendant," she said when she could, "how many of your 406 were human?" Marrow paused. "One," he said. "And how cold was he?" The Vesh did not answer. After a moment he inclined his head again and withdrew, and his footsteps went away down the empty corridor of a decommissioned wing, and Anvarr turned back to the table and found that her hands were shaking, and that she had a great deal of reading to do. The corpus opened at hour 40, and Anvarr Sel walked into 4,000 years of human medicine the way a diver walks off a shelf into deep water. It was not organized. That was the first thing. The Concord Clinical Index was a single vast crystal of cross-referenced fact, every entry ranked, every claim weighted by the strength of its evidence, every contradiction resolved by committee. The human corpus was a landfill. It contained peer-reviewed trials sitting beside case reports from field hospitals. It contained arguments. It contained journals in which one doctor called another doctor a fool by name and in print. It contained textbooks and lecture recordings and hand-drawn diagrams and a document, apparently taken seriously, in which a surgeon in a place called Edinburgh described in 40 pages the precise wrong way to hold a needle, having spent his career doing it. Half of it was wrong, whole centuries of it were wrong. They had bled people to cure fevers. They had drilled holes in skulls to let out things that were not there. And they had written all of it down, the errors and the corrections and the shouting, and they had kept the errors in the record, and they had gone on. Anvarr sat in the small dark office off Bay 9 with the terminal light on her face and read for 6 hours, and did not sleep, and did not eat, and at hour 46 she found the sentence. It was not in a trial. It was not in a Concord-style meta-analysis with 4,000 subjects and a confidence interval. It was in a teaching manual for emergency physicians, in a section on cold water drowning, printed as a standalone line with nothing before it and nothing after it, in the tone of a thing that everyone who does the work already knows. Nobody is dead until they are warm and dead. Anvarr read it 4 times. Then she read the case that sat under it, and the case was this. A woman had gone through the ice on a mountain river. She had been under the water for 80 minutes. Her heart had stopped. Her body temperature when they got her out was 13.7 degrees. By every clinical standard that existed on that world at that time, she had been dead for over an hour. There was no cardiac output. There was no respiration. There was no measurable brain activity. And a team of human doctors had put her on a bypass circuit and warmed her, 1 slow degree at a time, over 9 hours, and she had come back. She had come back with damage. It had taken her years, but she had walked again and worked again, and the paper included at the end for no clinical reason whatsoever, purely because a human had written it and could not help himself, a photograph of her standing in the snow, 5 years later on skis. Anvarr sat back in the dark. She thought they knew this. They knew this before they had gravity. They knew this when their medicine was still killing more people than it saved, and they knew it because they kept pulling children out of frozen ponds and refusing, every single time, to accept the obvious. And when they came to the Concord, they handed all of it over, and the Concord looked at the packaging and did not open the box. She began to search in earnest. Therapeutic hypothermia, the deliberate cooling of a body after cardiac arrest, standard human practice for centuries, on the explicit understanding that a cold brain consumes less and can wait. Concord equivalent, none. Concord classification of induced hypothermia, assault. Burst suppression, a pattern of cortical electrical activity seen in deep cold and deep sedation in which the brain goes silent for long intervals and then produces a brief crackle of coordinated firing. Not death, dormancy, a brain running at idle, and on the human electroencephalogram in the deepest phase of it an isoelectric trace. Flat, nothing. The Concord coherence grid measured 16 nodes and integrated over 11 minutes. It was calibrated on species whose neurons, at rest, still hummed, species whose cortical baseline never went to 0 unless the cells were dying. 11 minutes of flat line meant the same thing in 406 species. The lights are not out, the house has burned down. But a human brain at 28 degrees could go quiet for 20 minutes, and then speak once, and go quiet again. And the grid, integrating over 11, would never see it. Column, said Anvarr Sel, and her voice came out strange. Surgeon. The coherence channel, what is its sampling window? 11 minutes rolling. Values below the noise floor are reported as isoelectric and are not stored. Anvarr closed her eyes. Not stored, she said. Correct, the raw subthreshold trace is discarded to conserve. Stop discarding it. Surgeon. Stop discarding it, right now. I want every sample from every node at full temporal resolution, and I want it kept, and I want it displayed, and I do not care how much of it is noise. She was already on her feet. How far back can you recover? The buffer holds 9 hours. Give me 9 hours. The column gave her 9 hours. It came up on the wall of Bay 9 as a wide gray field, 16 bands, a fine haze of electrical nothing. The hum of the station, the pumps, the thermal churn of the girl's own cells. Anvarr stood in front of it with Tem beside her, and Rusk in the doorway and Bell with her hands still on the drip, and they looked at 9 hours of static. "There is nothing there," said Tem, and his voice cracked on it, because he had wanted so badly for there to be something there. "Column," said Anvarr, "filter for a coordinated event, any event. 2 or more nodes correlated above the local floor of any duration down to 1/10 of a second." The field flickered. And in 9 hours of gray, in a room with 4 people in it who had not slept, there were 3 marks. 3. One at hour 33, one at hour 37, one at hour 44. Each of them was a burst 40 milliseconds long, on 4 nodes at once, in the temporal band, and each of them was so small that the column had thrown it away 16 times before Anvarr told it not to. Nobody in the room breathed. "That is artifact," said Rusk at last, and he said it the way a man puts his hand over a candle to see whether it is really burning. "Pump harmonics, the filter cycles." "The filter cycles every 90 seconds, said Bellachir very quietly. "These are 40 minutes apart." "Then it is noise, random." "Column," said Anvarr. "Probability that 3 correlated 4-node events of this morphology occur by chance in 9 hours of recorded noise. Approximately 1 in 900. Anvarr Sel put her hand flat on the wall beneath the trace, and stood there, and let the 90 hours of her own exhaustion go through her like weather. "She is in there," she said. "Surgeon," Tem began. "She is in there, and she is cold, and she is running at idle, and every 11 minutes the machine that is supposed to be listening for her wipes the tape." Anvarr turned around. Her second lid swept and stayed a fraction too long. "Rusk, what is her core temperature?" The Grelth checked, 29.1. "We have been coming up half a degree every 3 hours since you cut the rate." "Stop coming up." Rusk's massive brow furrowed. "Stop. Take her down." The silence in Bay 9 acquired a texture. "Down," repeated Rusk. "To 30, no." Anvarr caught herself. The fatigue had her tongue. "She is at 29. I want 32 and held. Not warmer, not colder. 32 degrees is the human therapeutic band. It is cold enough to cut cerebral oxygen demand by 1/3 and warm enough that the clotting works and the heart will not fibrillate. They have been doing it for 600 years, Rusk. It is on page 4 of their manual. And Concord Code calls induced hypothermia an assault on the patient," said Rusk. "Article 12, it is not a gray area. It is a prohibited intervention." "Yes." "Marrow will add it to the filing." "Yes." Rusk looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the girl. Then he crossed the room and put his enormous gray hand on the warming lattice controller and turned it down. 32, he said, held. And that was the moment. Anvarr would think about it for the rest of her life, and she would never be able to explain to anyone why it was that moment and not one of the others. That was the moment when she stopped being a surgeon who was refusing to give up and became a surgeon who was treating a patient. Because everything changed after that. Not in the girl, in the room. She stopped asking the column what a body ought to be doing and started asking it what this body was doing. She threw out the conquered fluid targets and used the human ones, which were lower and stranger and correct. She stopped chasing a normal blood pressure and let the pressure sit low, because the human corpus was full of angry doctors insisting that a bleeding patient does not want a high pressure, it wants a clot. She swapped the sedation, because the Durun agents were metabolized in the liver, and the liver was cold and the drugs were stacking, and she found a human protocol for exactly that, written by a woman in a war, 400 years before Anvarr was born. At hour 51, the girl's kidneys made 11 milliliters of urine. Bella Cheer came out of the side room holding the collection bag in both her four-jointed hands like a relic, and she was crying, which the Vesh do freely and without embarrassment, and Tim laughed at her, and then had to turn around and put his forehead against the wall. 11 milliliters. Anvarr Sel looked at it for a long time. Column, she said, Serran Index. You disabled the display, Surgeon. I know what I did. Tell me the number. 0.07, said the column. It had moved. In 51 hours, it had moved 1/100th of a point. It needed to reach 0.1 in 45 hours, and the last time an index had risen from 0.07 to 0.1 in a body with no cortical trace was never. Not once. Not in 11,000 years. Good, said Anvarr, and meant it, and went to find something to eat, and fell asleep in a storage cupboard for 40 minutes with a ration bar unopened in her hand. Ket Von was in the corridor when she came out. He had been in the corridor, on and off, since hour 20. He was 17 and had a mended clavicle in a brace, and he had walked from Ward 4 on 2 decks with a wheeled drip stand, and he had sat down on the floor outside Bay 9 with his back to the wall, and every time a nurse sent him away he had gone away and come back. He stood up when he saw her, badly one-handed. Surgeon Sel. Deck apprentice. They say you are going to be. He stopped. Durham boys of 17 have exactly one register, and it is defiance, and it does not fit them. They say the board is going to take your license. They may. Because of me. Anvarr looked at him. No, she said, because of her. Ket's throat worked. His second lid swept and swept. I do not remember any of it, he said. That is the thing. I was at the cutting head and then I was in the ward and there is nothing between. Everyone keeps telling me what she did and I have to believe them and I cannot, I have nothing to put it in. I did not even know her. 11 days. She fixed my seal clamp on the second day and told me I was holding the torch like he swallowed, like a man afraid of it. Were you? Yes. Then it was good advice. Ket laughed, one wet crack of it, and then his face came apart, and Anvarr Sel, who had a patient dying 11 meters away and 45 hours in which to fail, stood in a corridor of a decommissioned wing, and let a 17-year-old deck apprentice weep against her shoulder for as long as he needed, because there was nothing else to be done with a debt like that except carry it. When he was finished, she said, "Come inside." I am not allowed. You are allowed, said Anvarr, because I am the chief surgeon of this station for another 45 hours and I say so. Come inside and sit where she can hear you. He stared. She cannot hear me. Anvarr thought of 3 marks in 9 hours of gray. Sit where she could hear you, she said, if she could. The belt crews came too after that. Not into the room. Bell would not have it. But Davion, the rescue lead off the lamplighter, brought a folded pressure suit and Wren Halloway's helmet, scuffed to hell and back, and set them on the chair by the door because that was what belt crews did for one of theirs. And she stood at the window of Bay 9 with her arms folded and her jaw set, and she did not say anything sentimental at all. She only said at the end to Anvarr, "You cut her warming rate." I did. Good. Davion's eyes were flat and dry. My grandmother pulled a kid out of a lake in Ontario, under 22 minutes. He's a shipwright now, 63 years old. She picked up the helmet, looked at it, set it down again. Everybody up here keeps telling me the machine is never wrong. I keep asking them how many of us it's ever been right about. She left. Anvarr Sel stood alone in the doorway of Bay 9 at hour 54 with the words "keep" going on the wall above the girl's head, and in the pocket of the folded suit on the chair, protruding a little, there was a small paper notebook, waxed against the damp, the kind of thing no civilized person had carried in 10,000 years. She did not open it, it was not hers. But she looked at it for a long time. Hour 61 was the worst hour of Anvarr Sel's professional life, and she had been a trauma surgeon for 91 years. It began with the heart. The left ventricle had a wedge in it, a 2-centimeter region of muscle that the shear had bruised so badly that it no longer contracted, a dead patch in a living pump. Anvarr had known about it since hour 3. She had been treating it the way any conquered surgeon would treat it, waiting for it to regenerate. That was what myocardium did. In every species in the clinical index, injured cardiac muscle either regenerated cleanly, cell by cell, over 4 to 9 days, guided by the body's own signaling, or it did not. And if it did not, the patient died, because a heart with a hole in its wall is a bag with a hole in it. At hour 61, the column reported that the wedge was not regenerating. It was doing something else. It was filling with a dense, disorganized, fibrous material that had no contractile fibers in it at all, that conducted no electrical signal, that was, by the column's read, functionally inert. Classification, said the column, aberrant repair, non-viable tissue. This finding is associated with progressive ventricular failure in 98% of comparable cases. And then at 61:14, the girl's heart stopped. It did not fibrillate. It simply slowed, and the arterial trace flattened out into a straight line, and every alarm in Bay 9 went off at once. Arrest! Bell had the crash tray open before the word was out of her. Anvarr was already at the table. She did not stop to think. 91 years put her hands where they needed to be, heel of the palm over the lower half of the sternum, 6 fingers laced, elbows locked, shoulders over the point of contact, and she began to compress a human chest, and the human chest gave under her hands in a way no Durun chest ever would, and she felt every single rib flex and thought with a lurch of horror that she was breaking her. Deeper, said Rusk. I will crush her. Deeper, their manual says 5 centimeters, page 11. The Grelth was bagging both hands, his eyes on the trace. You made me read it. Now do it. Anvarr Sel drove her hands down 5 centimeters into the chest of a 19-year-old girl, 110 times a minute, for 9 minutes and 40 seconds, and Tem took over for 4 minutes when her arms began to fail, and Bell took over from Tem, and Rusk, who could have done it one-handed, stayed at the airway because that was where he was needed, and at 61:24 the column said, in its calm, low voice, return of spontaneous circulation. Nobody cheered. Bell sat down on the floor where she stood. Anvarr braced her hands on the table rail and looked at the trace crawling back to life, and at the temperature, 32 degrees, held, exactly where she had put it, and she understood something that made her want to be sick. The cold had saved her. 9 minutes and 40 seconds of no cardiac output at 32 degrees was not the same as 9 minutes and 40 seconds at normal temperature. At 32 degrees, the brain's oxygen demand was a third lower. The thing she had done, that Article 12 called an assault, was the only reason those 9 minutes had not finished what the shear had started. And if she had followed conquered protocol, if she had rewarmed aggressively, as she had been taught, as she had done 430 times, the girl would have arrested warm at hour 20, with nobody in the room but a column counting down to a form. She had been doing it wrong her whole life. Not wrong for the Durun, not wrong for the Vesh or the Seth or the Grelth, wrong for the ones who were not in the book. Anvarr Sel stood in Bay 9 with a dead patch in a young woman's heart, and 11 kilos of her own certainty coming loose inside her, and she said, out loud to no one, how many? Surgeon, said Tem. How many humans, said Anvarr, have I cooled to 28 degrees in a sheer injury, and then warmed as fast as I could, and then buried? Nobody answered her. 11, she said, in 9 years on the station, 11. You did not know, said Bell, a cheer from the floor. No, said Anvarr, I did not read. She went back to work. Marrow came at hour 66 with the formal notice, and read it standing in the doorway, and did not step across. The cessation board would convene in Administration Hall at hour 96. 3 officers, Attendant Marrow presiding, Administrator Andrel Sae, and Surgeon Adjunct Kaido as medical peer. The finding would rest on a single value. If the Serran Index of the patient Wren Halloway stood above 0.1 at the moment of convening, treatment would continue, and Anvarr Sel would face a censure hearing at a later date for the unauthorized induction of hypothermia. If it stood at or below 0.1, cessation would be enforced within the hour, and Marrow's motion for suspension of license would be heard immediately after. He recited it all in that dry, colorless voice, and when he was finished, he stood a moment longer than the reading required. "The index is at 0.07, he said. "Yes. It has moved 1/100th of a point in 66 hours. "Yes. Chief Surgeon, a muscle moved somewhere in the long Vesh face. You cooled her." "I did." "Why?" "Because a species that spent 4,000 years dying of cold," said Anvarr Sel, "learned some things about it." Marrow looked past her, at the small figure on the table, and at the scuffed helmet on the chair by the door, and at the folded suit with the paper notebook in the pocket. "I would like," he said, "to be wrong." And he went away. She did not sleep. That was a mistake, and she knew it was a mistake, and at hour 70 she made a worse one. She stood up too fast from the terminal, and the room folded sideways, and she went down on one knee, and Rusk picked her up off the floor of the office with one hand under her arm as though she weighed nothing at all, which to a Grelth she did. "4 hours, he said. "I do not have 4 hours. "You have 26, and you will spend all of them being stupid unless you sleep 4. He set her on the cot in the corner as if she were a piece of equipment being stowed. "I will run her. Bell will run her. Tim will run her, and he will be terrible at it, and it will make him a surgeon." "Rusk." "Sleep." "Rusk," she caught his wrist. It was like catching a bollard. "Why did you come back?" The Grelth stood very still. "Because I read what you sent me," he said at last. "The war one, the woman who wrote the sedation protocol." He looked at the wall. "I have anesthetized 19,000 patients. I have never once read a paper by somebody who had no drugs and no light and did it anyway. And I found that I had been thinking my whole life that medicine was a thing that got handed down from the top, from the conquered, from the index, from people like you." His small, deep eyes came back to her. "And it is not. It is a thing people invent, in the dark, because they will not put the body down." He pulled his wrist free, gently. "Also," he said, "the girl went back into a sheer front for a boy she had known 11 days. I have 4 children. Sleep, Anvarr." She slept for 3 hours and 11 minutes, and dreamed of nothing, and woke at hour 73 to find Tim standing over her with his face lit up like a beacon and a printout in his hands. "6, he said. "6 what?" "Bursts. 6 of them, Surgeon, in the last 9 hours. I filtered the whole buffer the way you showed me. And there were 3 in 9 hours before, and now there are 6, and 2 of them are on 9 nodes, not 4, and the last one was 90 milliseconds. Anvarr took the printout. She looked at it for a long time in the dark of the storage room with the young Durun vibrating beside her, and she felt her chest do something painful and unfamiliar, something that she had spent 91 years training herself not to feel in a hospital. Hope was a professional hazard. Iol and Vaughn had said that. Hope makes you cut where you should not cut. But this was not hope, this was data. "It is doubling," she said. "Yes." "As she warms." "Yes, and it maps, Surgeon. It maps to the temperature curve. We came up half a degree at hour 68 for the arrhythmia, and there are 2 bursts inside the hour after. Then it is not artifact, and it is not chance, and it is not the pumps." Anvarr stood up. The room stayed where it was. "It is a brain, Tim. It is a cold brain running at idle, doing the only thing it has the fuel to do, which is to check every so often whether it is time to wake up. "The index has not moved," said Tim. And there it was. "No," said Anvarr. "It has not. Because the index integrated over 11 minutes, and a burst was 90 milliseconds, and 90 milliseconds inside 11 minutes rounded to 0. The Serran function could not see her. It was not that the number was wrong. It was that the number was blind, and it had been blind for 11,000 years, and nobody had noticed because in 406 species there had never been anything in the dark to see. "Then we make her warm enough," said Anvarr Sel, "that the machine can hear her." It was, she knew, the exact wrong reason to do a thing. She spent hour 74 to hour 88 running the most careful piece of medicine she had ever done in her life, and she did almost none of it herself. She had rusk on the temperature, 0.4 of a degree per hour, no faster, because the human corpus was full of doctors screaming about rewarming shock, about the potassium dumping back out of the cells, about the vessels opening all at once and the pressure falling through the floor. 0.4 an hour. 32 to 34 in 5 hours, 34 to 35 in 3 more. She had bell on the chemistry, hour by hour, minute by minute, the potassium riding up and being beaten down, the magnesium, the phosphate, the endless dull grind that keeps a body's electricity honest. She had Tem on the heart. The wedge of fibrous tissue was still there, still inert, still growing, and the column still called it aberrant. And at hour 79 Anvarr Sel stood in front of the wall display with her arms folded and looked at it and finally understood what she was looking at. "It is not failing to regenerate," she said. Tem lifted his head. "Surgeon. It is not trying to regenerate. Column human cardiac repair, post-infarction. What is the mechanism?" "Human myocardium," said the column, "has negligible regenerative capacity. Injured cardiac tissue is replaced by collagenous scar." "Scar?" "Yes. Not muscle." "Correct. The scarred region is non-contractile and permanent." "And the human survives." The column paused. "Frequently," it said. "Yes." Anvarr Sel began, very quietly, to laugh. It was not an entirely well sound, and Bell looked up sharply from the drug tray. "They do not repair," Anvarr said. "They patch. They take the hole and they fill it with something that is not muscle and will never be muscle, something ugly and stiff and dead, and they seal the wall, and the rest of the heart simply works harder, forever, around the patch." She turned to the room. "Every species in the index either grows the tissue back or dies. Humans do neither. Humans get worse permanently and keep going." "That is not repair," said Tim. "That is damage." "Yes," said Anvarr. "And she will carry it for the rest of her life, and it will make her tired going upstairs when she is 50, and she will be alive at 50. She was already at the console. Stop treating the scar. We have been giving her regenerative signaling factors for 80 hours. Every one of them is telling a wound that will not close to open. Stop it. All of it. Support the patch. Drop the afterload, keep the wall tension off it, and let her build her ugly little wall." They stopped the factors at hour 80. At hour 83, the ventricular function improved by 4%. At hour 86, the pericardial drain, which had been pulling 5 milliliters an hour for 2 days, pulled 1. At hour 88, the Serran Index stood at 0.09. Anvarr sat down in the chair by the door, next to the folded pressure suit, and put her head back against the wall, and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding for 8 hours. 8 hours to the board, 0.09. She needed 0.11. The index would not move without coherence. Coherence would not move until the grid could see a burst. The grid could not see a burst until the bursts joined up into something continuous, and the bursts would not join up until the brain was warm enough and fed enough and rested enough to stop idling and start living, and there was no drug in the galaxy that made that happen. There was no cut she could make. There was nothing left in her hands. She had spent 88 hours doing every single thing she knew how to do, and everything she had learned to do, and she had run all the way to the end of medicine for the second time in 4 days, and this time there was no archive left to read. The rest was the girl. Anvarr Sel sat forward and put her elbows on her knees and her face in her long gray-green hands, and for the first time in 91 years, in a room with a patient in it, she let herself be afraid. Then she got up and went to the table and pulled the chair over, and sat down beside Wren Halloway and took the human's cold hand in both of hers, which no conquered surgeon would ever do, because it is not treatment, and because it does nothing, and because there is no article in the code that permits it. "Apprentice Halloway," she said. The ventilator sighed. The pumps hummed. On the wall, 16 bands of gray static rolled slowly on toward the 96th hour. "You do not know me," said Anvarr Sel. "You have never seen my face. I am the surgeon who told a room at hour 19 that you were finished, and I was very sure because I have been sure for 91 years and it has always been enough." She turned the girl's hand over. The callus on the thumb, she still did not know what it was from. "You went back for him," she said, "into a collapsing field, for a boy you had known 11 days, of a species you barely knew, who could not have thanked you if you had died. Nothing in my science can tell me why. I have read 4,000 years of your medicine now, and it does not explain you either. It only says, over and over in 100 languages in the handwriting of exhausted people, keep going, keep going. Nobody is dead until they are warm and dead." Somewhere below them, a hauler kicked its engines, and the bones of Kesh anchorage shuddered. "I have 8 hours," said Anvarr. "Then they will take you away from me, and they will be right to, by every law I have ever believed in. So I am going to sit here, and I am going to keep you warm, and I am going to ask you for one thing." She leaned in close to the small pale ear. "Come back," she said. "You have been idling long enough." And the monitor did not change. At hour 91, the monitor changed. Anvarr Sel did not see it happen. That was the thing she would find hardest to forgive herself for, later, and easiest to laugh about, much later than that. After 91 hours of not taking her eyes off a 19-year-old human being, she was looking at the floor. It was Tim who saw it. He had been running the coherence filter every 20 minutes, because Anvarr had told him to, and because he was 11 years past his first cut, and had not yet learned how to stop doing what he was told. He was standing at the wall display with the printout curling out of his hand, and he made a noise. It was not a word. Darun do not have a word for it. Anvarr came out of the chair so fast, she nearly took the drip stand with her. The gray field on the wall was not gray. There, on the far right, in the last 4 minutes of the buffer, in the live band, in the part of the trace that was happening now, in this room in this second, there was a spike, and 40 milliseconds after it, another, and then a cluster, and then a run of them ragged, uneven, on 11 nodes, and then 12, and then all 16, a stuttering, broken, crackling train of coordinated electrical fire climbing out of the noise floor of a brain that had been silent for 91 hours. "Burst suppression," said Anvarr Sel. Her voice did not sound like her own. "That is burst suppression, Rusk temperature." 35.8, said the Grelth, and his gravel had gone strange and thin. "We crossed 35 at hour 90. "Column." Anvarr was at the display, both hands flat against it, her second lid sweeping. "Coherence." "Coherence channel reports isoelectric," said the column. "What?" "Detected events are of insufficient duration to exceed the sampling floor. Integration window is 11 minutes. Reported coherence, 0.02. Serran Index, 0.09. Change the window." "Surgeon, the 11-minute window is a fixed parameter of the Serran." "Then compute it outside the Serran," snarled Anvarr, "and give me the number as a human electroencephalogram, at human sampling rates, with the human classification set that I told you to index 70 hours ago, and do it now." The column paused for 1.5 seconds, which was, for the column, an eternity. The wall changed. It stopped being a conquered coherence grid, 16 COM bands of integrated nothing, and became something older and cruder and infinitely more alive. 16 jagged running lines, sampling at 400 Hz, drawn the way a species had drawn them for 300 years, because it was the only way they had ever had of listening to the inside of a skull. And in that language, the trace was not flat. In that language, the trace was screaming. "Pattern classification," said the column, "burst suppression, ratio approximately 1 to 9, with progressive shortening of the suppression interval. Human reference, consistent with recovering cortical function following profound hypothermic arrest. Prognostic significance in the human corpus, favorable." Bellachir dropped a tray. "Favorable," said Rusk. "That is not my finding," said the column. "That is theirs. I am reading it out of a textbook." "Read it again," said Anvarr Sel. "Favorable." Nobody moved, and then all at once everybody did. "It could still be artifact," Anvarr said, and she said it savagely, and she said it because she had to, because 91 years of discipline stood up in her at that exact moment and grabbed her by the throat. Reflex, spinal, a dying cortex firing off. "I will not walk into that board with a maybe. Bell, I need a stimulus." "Pain," said Bell. "No," Anvarr turned, "sound." They had to go and get him. Ket Von was asleep in the corridor with his back against the wall and his brace crooked, and Tem shook him awake so hard the boy nearly swung at him. And then they hauled him into Bay 9 and put him in the chair beside the table, and he stared at the machines with the raw terror of a 17-year-old who has been told nothing. "What do I do?" he said. "Talk to her," said Anvarr. "About what?" "Anything, your name, what she said about the torch. Tell her she is holding it like a man afraid of it." "She cannot." "Column," said Anvarr Sel, "mark the trace." Ket Von leaned toward the ear of the human girl who had gone into a sheer front for him, and swallowed, and said, in a cracked 17-year-old voice, in Durun Standard, "Wren, it is Ket, from the Lamplighter. You told me I hold a torch like a coward." "Nothing." He looked up, desperate. "Again," said Anvarr. "Wren, it is Ket." And on the wall, 360 milliseconds after the boy said her name, on 11 nodes, in the temporal band, where the human corpus said the auditory cortex lived, where it had said so for 400 years, in a diagram some Earth anatomist had drawn by hand and nobody in the Concord had ever bothered to open, the trace jumped. "Event," said the column. "Again," whispered Anvarr. "Wren." "Event, latency 340 milliseconds, morphology consistent." "Again." "Wren," Ket was weeping now, both hands on the table rail. "Wren, wake up, please. Please wake up. I am here. I am fine. You did it. I am fine." "Event, event." "Event." Anvarr Sel stood in the middle of Bay 9, under the words "keep going," and watched a dead girl answer to her name 11 times in 90 seconds, and felt the whole architecture of 11,000 years of her people's certainty come down around her like a hull breach. It was not a miracle. That was what undid her. If it had been a miracle, she could have knelt to it. But it was not a miracle. It was a measurement. A real, reproducible, stimulus-locked, latency-consistent measurement. The kind of thing she would have accepted from a first-year student. The kind of thing that had been sitting there in the noise for 3 days waiting for one person in the entire civilized galaxy to be stubborn enough to look. "She is in there," said Anvarr Sel, and her second lid swept and stayed closed a long time. "She has been in there the whole time." The cessation board convened in administration hall at hour 96 and lasted 4 minutes. Attendant Marrow read the finding. Administrator Andrel Sae sat with his feathers flat and his hands folded. Surgeon Adjunct Kaido, who had spent 4 days quietly covering every trauma case on the station without complaint, looked at the wall. "The Serran Index of the patient Wren Halloway," said Marrow, "stands at 0.11. He said it, and then he stopped, and he looked at the number on the slate in his hand as though it had bitten him. "It crossed at hour 94, said Anvarr. "It will cross 0.2 by tomorrow. It will keep going." "The board notes," said Marrow slowly, "that the index rose only after the surgeon of record instructed the diagnostic array to abandon the Serran coherence channel and substitute a precontact human classification set." "Yes. That is not a permitted procedure." "No. It is, in fact," said Marrow, "the most serious methodological violation I have encountered in 22 years of service." "Yes," said Anvarr Sel. The attendant set the slate down. "And it worked," he said. The hall was very quiet. "Attendant," said Andrel Sae, "your motion." Marrow stood there for a long moment, a tall, dry, colorless man whose entire life had been built on a number, being shown, in a hard, bright room, that the number could not see in the dark. "Withdrawn," he said, "and I will file a second motion in its place, if the board will hear it." "Name it." "That the Serran Index be suspended, immediately and Concord-wide for all patients of human origin," said Attendant Marrow, "pending recalibration, and that the human clinical corpus be integrated at full priority." He picked the slate back up, and his hand was not entirely steady. "There are 211 petabytes in it. It has been sitting in our archive for 41 years. I have witnessed 406 cessations, Administrator. I would like to know how many of them I got wrong because I did not read." Wren Halloway opened her eyes at hour 103. She did not wake, not properly. It took another 9 days for that, and 11 more before she could hold a thought for longer than a minute, and 4 months before she could get out of a chair without help. The corpus had warned about all of it. The corpus, in fact, had a name for the long, fogged, bewildering climb back, and had written more about it than the Concord had ever written about anything, because humans had been dragging one another back up that slope for 4,000 years and had a great deal to say on the subject. But at hour 103, in Bay 9, with the light down low and Rusk asleep upright in the corner like a boulder and Tim making notes he would keep for the rest of his career, the girl's eyelids came apart, and her eyes rolled and found nothing, and rolled again, and found a long gray-green face bent over her with a second eyelid sweeping sideways, and stopped. "Apprentice Halloway," said Anvarr Sel, "squeeze my hand." And the human squeezed her hand. 3 months later, Wren Halloway walked into the office of the chief surgeon of Kesh Anchorage with a cane in her right hand, and stood in the doorway, and looked around it with frank belt-crew rudeness. "They said you'd have a bigger office," she said. Her voice was still rough. The tube had cost her something. "For a woman who broke the whole galaxy's rulebook." "They took the big office," said Anvarr Sel, "and gave me the review committee. It is a punishment disguised as an honor, and it is working." Wren laughed, and it hurt, and she put a hand flat on her sternum where the scar ran, and the laugh went on anyway. She was thin. She would be thin for a year. There was a wedge of stiff, dead collagen in the wall of her left ventricle that would never contract again, and she had been told, in careful language, that stairs would always cost her more than they cost other people, and that she would not dive again, not deep, not in a hard suit, not at pressure. She had taken that news, Bell reported, by looking at the ceiling for 11 seconds and then asking what else she could do instead. "Sit," said Anvarr. Wren sat. Then she reached into her jacket and put a small waxed paper notebook on the desk between them and slid it across. "Dovey said you looked at this," she said, "for 4 days and never opened it." "It was not mine." "It's yours now." Anvarr Sel looked at the battered little thing. "What is in it?" "Lists," said Wren. "That's all. I make lists. Stuff I want to do when I get my rating, stuff I want to see, stuff I want to fix. It's stupid. It's just—" She stopped and rubbed her thumb, the one with the callus, along the edge of the cover, and Anvarr saw at last exactly where the callus came from and had to look away for a moment. "It's just how I keep going. You write the next thing down. And then you do the next thing." "That," said Anvarr Sel, "is the entire content of 211 petabytes of your medicine, apprentice. Compressed." Wren grinned. "Yeah, well, we're not that complicated." "No," Anvarr agreed. "You are not complicated at all. You are simply very difficult to finish." She teaches now. She still cuts 3 days a week, and she is still the best pair of hands on the station, and the residents fight to scrub with her. But 2 days a week, she stands in the small lecture theater off Ward 4 in front of 11 young surgeons of 6 species, and she puts up on the wall a gray field with 16 bands of nothing in it, and she asks them what they see. They always say the same thing. They say, "Nothing, surgeon." They say, "That patient is dead." And Anvarr Sel says, "That is what I said." Then she filters the field, at 400 hertz, in a language written by people who had no gravity and no field medicine, and nothing at all except 4,000 years of refusing to put the body down. And the nothing becomes a crackle, and the crackle becomes a name being answered. And 11 young surgeons of 6 species sit in the dark and watch a 19-year-old hull diver's brain climb out of the cold, one burst at a time, 90 milliseconds at a time, hour after hour after hour, while everyone in the room but one had already written her off. "The index is a good machine," she tells them every time at the end. "It is the best thing my people ever built. It has been right 61,000 times, and it will be right 61,000 more, and one day it will be right about me. But it does not measure whether the patient can live. It measures how fast the body is dying, and it assumes, because every body we ever put under it agreed, that a thing which has stopped is a thing that has stopped for good. It cannot see a body that has simply gone quiet and is waiting and intends to come back. So watch the monitor. Watch it with everything you have. It will tell you more in a second than your hands will tell you in an hour. But do not let it be the last thing you look at in the room. The last thing you look at is the patient. Because I stood over that girl at hour 19 with my hand above the form, and every number in this hospital told me she was finished, and every one of those numbers was honest, and every one of them was wrong, and the only reason she is alive, and walking, and out there on the docks this morning teaching rescue drill to apprentices with a cane in her hand, is that at the last possible moment before I pressed it, I looked away from the machine and I looked at her. And I thought she went back for him. So I will go back for her,